We are very excited to be joined today by legendary video game composer and all-around media guru, Tim Follin. Tim, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's lovely to be here.
So we just kind of want to dive into this. We're so lucky and fortunate to be able to talk with you today. The first thing we wanted to touch on is about your origin. When was it that you, and I guess your brother Jeff as well, when was it that both of you realized that you wanted to compose your own music and that was something that you could get paid to do?
Well, in my case, it was a kind of shock to realise that you could do that for a living, to be honest, because I started off sort of at 14, 15, tinkering with a ZX Spectrum, which is British, the cheapest computer, basically. It was one of those... It was great because it didn't matter how much cash you had, you could probably afford a Spectrum. It was really a cheap thing, but it was also a great experimental tool, really.
Yeah.
So I sort of sat there and tinkered with it for a few years, probably. And at the same time, my older brother Mike was programming, and he just sort of. Well, he flunked out of university, actually. He kind of was doing a chemistry degree and just gave it up and thought, this isn't for me, I want to do computers, sort of thing.
The classic programming backup plan.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, not that he was ever going to be a chemist, but there you go. So he was into that, and he kind of was the first in the house to get a Spectrum, and as soon as I saw that, I thought, that's for me, that's what I need to be doing. Yeah. And I started tinkering even with the Spectrum, trying to make different sounds, programming, but basically all programming. Well, music was not really the objective at that point. It was just about programming and making sounds, So it was kind of, I had music running sort of parallel at that time. When I left school, I did a year of music college, but realised that wasn't really what I was going to be doing. Really, not the particular type of college that I was at. To be honest, it was kind of jazz based, and it was very. Oh. It was kind of. I think it was called. There was either a light music course or a jazz course or something. I don't know. God knows what the light music course was going to be, but I just kind of realised earlier on it wasn't really going to be whatever it wasn't for me, sort of thing. Right. So, but around the time that was kind of, I was, realising that my brother Mike had got a job at Software Creations, and that was kind of, I remember asking, are there any jobs going, for programmers or whatever there, and he said, well, actually you can do, there's a sound design vacancy sort of thing, right? You can go for that. So I remember walking in to Richard Kay's office, who owned the business, and as he used to tell me, I put my feet on the desk, apparently. I don't remember doing this, right? And he said, okay, do you want a job? And that it was just a bizarre, I didn't think it was real, really. I didn't think this was a real thing that you could do, but it turned out it was.
Well, that also kind of leads me into something else, and we've been chatting a little bit before this, but the sense that people all around the world are still enjoying your music and still so inspired by it, I can't imagine that was anything that you had in your brain at that time or could even fathom that.
No, not at all. Still not in my brain, to be honest. It's still hard to fathom because it was such a sort of accidental route in for me. It was kind of, you got to think that video game music wasn't even a thing that people did at that point. It wasn't a career option, so it wasn't really, I didn't really think I need to get into writing video game music, Right. The closest I got to that was thinking I'd like to be involved in video games somehow, so that was it, really. It was more a case of, I want to just be doing something involving computers rather than music specifically,
Sure. Well, I'm really curious, and I know Carl is as well, because as brothers ourselves who frequently work together on music and, this podcast for a number of years, we're both really fascinated with the creative bond that brothers share. When did you begin collaborating with Jeff, and how did your collaboration work?
It kind of, what happened was Jeff was, again at university, he had done a agricultural degree, I think. It was something completely different.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was kind of, he'd sort of finished the course and he had got a job working for the Potato Marketing Board, right, in Britain.
Yes!
Are you
the
taking
pinnacle.
notes, kids? This is the fast
this
track
is the
to
path.
becoming a
This is
game
how you do
composer.
it. This is how you get in. Potato marketing bot. So he his first job, he was walking around fields with one of those wheels on a stick, measuring the perimeter of the fields.
Yeah, I mean, we've all done that. in
Well,
college.
yeah, I mean that's just all part of growing up. But basically, he at the time I was working at Suffolk Creations, and I remember him saying he kind of dawned on him that I was just having fun at Suffolk Creations, making music, and he was walking around a field with a stick. So I said, well, look, I can probably get you a job doing this because you'll find this pretty easy to do. I would have thought because I kind of knew instinctively that we'd have the same sort of understanding of it, even though. The thing is, Jeff had no background whatsoever in computers. He wasn't interested at all.
Oh, wow.
So for him, it was kind of just, he was interested in music, so he came at it pretty much from a musical point of view, and I came at it from a technical point of view. So from a technical perspective, I basically just tutored him on how to make sounds, how to, make it work, basically, and what to do, and the different techniques you used. And so he basically went away and used the music driver that I had written. He picked it up pretty much straight away and just started composing, So we collaborated, I would have thought, on a few tunes now and again. We would sort of suggest, because the way you wrote, well, the way we wrote at the time was very linear, so you'd write something, you'd get it working, and then you'd think, right, what do we do next? And then you'd write another bit.
Right.
And you can hear that if you listen to music. It's basically, we're just making it up as we go along, literally.
Well, yeah, I think that is something that people respond to about your music is the sense of spontaneity and the sense of excitement. It's almost like you guys are just taking a solo and you don't really know where the music's going to go.
No.
And it's definitely a nice contrast to a lot of other video game music, which might be a little bit more predictable.
Yeah, but the thing is, I remember learning that later on, and I thought, I'm going to do it properly now. I'm going to organise this music, and kind of have a proper middle, beginning, and end sort of thing that wraps up and everything. And it was just boring, I remember getting the feedback from the guy and saying, yeah, it's nice, but it's kind of boring. And I remember thinking, yeah, you're right, yeah, this is boring.
Well, that's something that no one could ever describe about your music, is that it is boring. And the thing that is great about it is, even though it has these various sections, because it is game music, for instance, one of my favorite examples of kind of this changing section that ultimately loops back into itself is in the game Plock. There's the beach music, and eventually it has this like alternate section that gets like really funky and almost has a slower tempo. But I just love the way that it loops back into the top of the form, because it's able to do these different sections, but then it's able to kind of come back around, and it all feels really natural and exciting. I think. Maybe I got lucky with that one, to be honest. But it was always linear. I don't think I planned anything, but what I used to like the fact that I didn't know what to do next, and if it had to loop, I then had to come up with a way of looping back, and it's it's sort of necessity being the mother of invention sometimes, isn't it? You kind of
we talk about that so much on the podcast, that harsh limitations really does foster creativity, and if it wasn't for those harsh limitations, I don't think we would have had so much wonderful music that we had back then.
It's absolutely true, and I think when the 8-bit era sort of came to an end, I really floundered because I didn't really want I didn't find writing Red Book, real music. I just didn't want to do it. I wasn't. It wasn't something that I was not. I was kind of, I'd write things personally myself, just as a relaxation, I guess. In the background sort of thing. When I was doing 8-bit music, I used to write. We had a 4-track recorder at the time, and we used to do recordings and stuff and mess around with things. But it was never anything that was kind of. I didn't want to do that for a living. I don't know. It just didn't feel like it was something I could do on demand. That.
Well, it kind of reminds me of another conversation we've had with I think it was also another British game composer. It might have been Matt Furness, Will, if you can recall. But he was talking about that he was also kind of programming was his way in, and once it got to a point where there wasn't that challenge and there wasn't that sense of like almost putting the puzzle pieces together, it kind of that lost a lot of excitement for him. So I imagine it was similar for you.
Definitely, yeah. It was also the fact that that's your thing, I mean, there's lots of, anyone can write, well, not anyone, but, there are lots of musicians out there writing music and doing it, that's what they've done all the time. I was at music college with lots of them, they were kind of proficient, very, very proficient and very, very talented people who could do that, but
Right.
it wasn't game music that they were doing. And so there was that thing of, as soon as the 8-bit thing finished, it was kind of that collaboration between programming and music was gone, that was it, sort of thing. So even though I stayed in the industry for quite a few years after that, I think I wanted to get out from the moment that happened, to be honest. Yeah.
Well, and Tim, it makes so much sense actually hearing you say that, because we've played your music on our podcast for years, and one of the things that we've always celebrated about it is it doesn't, so much video game music requires imagination. You kind of need to, you hear these primitive sounds and you kind of have to really use your imagination to sort of think, oh, what would this be? Would this be kind of like a guitar and a bass? And oh, isn't that cute? But with the music that you were able to create on the NES, it's so bold and stylistic, and you don't really have to use your imagination in the same way. When I'm listening to a piece of music from, say, like Silver Surfer, it sounds so advanced and sophisticated, and really there's these amazing sounds that you're able to get out of that primitive sound chip that when I'm listening to it, I don't really want to hear guitars. I don't want to hear, a different altered version. Like, it sounds as good as it would ever need to. And that's a distinct quality, I think, that your music has, and is why so many people really resonate with it to this day.
Hear, hear.
Well, it's really, it's strange and great to hear, people, your sort of perception of it now, and to hear you say that, because it's kind of, I did, my inspiration at the time was kind of real. I used to try and approach it from a point of view of an instrumentalist playing it, or this would be a flautist, or this would be a guitarist, or whatever.
Right.
But at the same time, it was kind of very obvious that it's not that. It is its own thing, and so you can take that inspiration. But I didn't stress about it not sounding real, in quotes, or not sounding like the instrument I was, because to me it was kind of it was its own thing, so I still think of, like, the Commodore 64 or those sound chips as instruments. They are actually instruments themselves,
right.
So it's kind of meaningless to sort of call them, to try and make them emulate a different instrument when that's what they are. But you can take, having said that, you can take the the thinking behind various instruments, and kind of transcribe that into it. And it's not so much that you want them, like I say, to sound like the instruments. It's just the thinking behind how you go about playing those instruments,
Well, yeah, I mean, if you take an example like your work on Ghouls and Ghosts, the intro to that, how it just really screams Jethro Tull to not just me, but I think a lot of people have found that comparison.
And to me.
The way that you get something that sounds like a flute. So it's clear that was maybe one of your goals at the time, was how can I get close to the vibe of this music that I love? Yeah. Were there any other goals that you had when creating video game music back then?
Not really. Ghouls and Ghosts is kind of an exception in that respect, because that was more deliberate, more of a stylistic choice, because, I wanted to do something that moved away from the kind of very synthy, arpeggiated sort of thing that, I was doing a lot of at that time.
Right.
And just try and do something different. And so it was more of a conscious decision to do that with that particular one. But for the other stuff, no, it was really, in a way, the other stuff is more specific to the chip, to chip music, I think, than Ghouls and Ghosts is, because I was just thinking, what sounds good on this synthesizer, essentially, what... Mm-hmm. I mean, that, when people first heard the Minimoog, or they first heard, whatever instrument it was, when you hear something fresh, you think, well, that's a really interesting sound. So, and you just it's really just a big experimental thing with sound. You're just experimenting with sounds, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that's how I approached it. It was kind of not really trying to make it anything particular, or the inspiration wasn't coming from anywhere particular, apart from, obviously, I was listening to, as prog rock and various instruments. But I wasn't trying to emulate that particularly. It was just that was what I was into, and that was how my mind worked at that point.
What were some of the biggest prog rock bands that you were into before you started and while you were working in video games?
First prog rock, I don't know if you could call ELO a prog rock band, actually. I mean, that was the first band that I was properly into, but that was when I was sort of 7 or 8.
Okay.
Do you know ELO?
It's getting there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It is, isn't it? It's sort of out of the blue. It's kind of borderline prog rock in places. You know? But then, probably when I was 12 or 13, I discovered Genesis. That was early Genesis. So that was kind of, that took over for quite a few years, the Genesis thing. But at the same time, I had someone introduce me to Jethro Tull, and that folk side of it was really, that really appealed to me. So I was listening to sort of folk. Probably I'm trying to think, probably around that period, I was listening to that kind of thing, a mix of folk and prog rock. And obviously, Yes, I grew up listening to Yes as well, so they were a big influence.
That's awesome. Yeah, I definitely hear that a lot. Yeah. I hear a lot of Yes influence in your music as well, so that's great to hear.
Well, the intro to Solstice is just ripped completely from the opening of... what is it? Starship Trooper, I think, from Yes. Yeah, it's just a complete lift, because we saw it live, and we went to see them live in London, and I remember thinking, I like that intro where he kind of did this really quiet intro, and then it kind of kicked in with this big thing, and that's all Solstice was, the intro music. It was just...
That's so awesome. And I think one thing that I really love about that is, in some ways, and I don't know if you thought about this at all, but you're introducing a whole other generation to that kind of music. Like, imagine a 9-year-old kid playing that game and hearing that, and for the first time being introduced to that musical world. It's really cool.
Well, that's the thing, because in a way, I was I was kind of 15 in mid-80s, wasn't I? So it was already in the past for me at that point. Certainly I was listening to early Genesis. That was from the early 70s. I wasn't conscious at that point, you know what I mean, to listen to. So I only got into those things when I was in my teens. So it was I already had the sense of, this is from, this is out of date, essentially. This is from the past.
Sure. So Tim, another thing that whenever we've played your music on our podcast, sort of a rule of thumb, or almost like just a running gag between Carl and I, is whatever platform you're working on, whatever console a Tim Follin track comes on, it always sounds like so much more advanced than what anyone else was doing, almost regardless of the platform. It's so astounding to both of us, but I'm curious to you, what platform did you find to be the most creatively rewarding to work on?
I kind of flipped between Commodore, the 64, and the SNES, actually, because I think the SNES was kind of just a really nice kind of mix of, because the thing is, it might not be all that obvious unless you've actually programmed the SNES, but even though it had sample playback, it was so limited. It was kind of, it was its own limitation as well, sort of thing. So it didn't feel like, it was nice to have that kind of, what can we get out of this machine thing again, so it was, I still see that as a sort of 8-bit thing, really,
Well, I mean, just the incredible limitation in size that you had to work with.
Yeah, the sample size was kind of crazy small, wasn't it? It was, I can't remember how many, I can't remember what the meg was, but it was tiny. Yeah, it was a tiny amount. I don't think it was meg, actually. It might not have even been meg. It might have been K.
Something K, yeah.
But it was it was kind of, that was still the challenge of what we could do with it, what I could do with it. I mean, that was my thing. But I mean, I don't know, they've all got their own thing, haven't they? I think... the 64 still, because of the sounds you could make on the 64, but I kind of like the NES as well, the NES. Difficult to say, really. Definitely not the Amiga and the AY, I'll put it that way. the AY chip was just a nightmare. I hated that.
So I'm also curious, as someone who's done a little bit of experimenting with chiptune stuff myself, have you ever played around with any like modern trackers, things like FamiTracker or anything like that? Because I'm just so curious.
I haven't, no.
What your interface was like when you were, say, working on the NES.
Well, this is the thing. My interface was a development of the music driver that I coded myself when I was sort of 14 or something, really, for the Spectrum. So it never really evolved that much, really, from that. Early on, when I first started programming the Spectrum, I remember basically coding assembly language. It was kind of just coding the sounds. And the music was just a list of numbers, so it was actually frequency and duration pairs. That's all it was, and I had to remember the frequencies as well. So it was kind of, it was just the number was the pitch, just because I didn't know how to convert text, I didn't it was partly that, and partly as you went higher up the if you played too many higher notes together, the overall pitch would drop, so you'd have to alter the frequency slightly to make that still sound in tune, so it was a very manual sort of process.
Wow.
But that kind of process of number pairs, I just took with me to the Commodore 64, so all of that Commodore 64 stuff was programmed straight into an assembler with in pairs of numbers, basically. So I was typing in, by that point the first number would be the actual note, but it wouldn't be a note. So I wouldn't type in C or whatever. I would type in 100 or something.
Right.
And then it would be, the duration would be in terms of cycles per second, so it was 60 or 50 according to...
Would this all be existing in your mind? Did you just have to remember the frequencies, or would you write them down so that you would know, like...
In the Spectrum case, yeah, I just remember them. I mean, in when I was doing Commodore 64 onwards, the pitches were just notes, so 100 would be... whatever, A or something, and I'd think chromatically from that. So, as Jeff will remember doing this as well, my brother, we'd know, if you want to go up a fifth, you go up 7 semitones, so you add 7, so it's 107, and it's, so everything we did was thinking in terms of chromatics, and just doing the maths, the simple maths, from that chromatic point of view. So I never knew what key I was writing in, but it did mean that I could change key and not really notice. It was just, it wasn't suddenly I was in a different key. It was more, now we're just, instead of 100 now being a bass, it's 104 or something, and we've gone up.
Right.
And you just carry on doing the maths, But it was so, in a way, non-musical in that respect. We didn't conform to any kind of even musical notes, we didn't even talk about notes. We just talked about pitches and chromatic intervals and things, so
and then when you listen to the finished product, it almost makes it even more impressive when you think about how it was made, because a finished product seems so musical, and like we said before, seems so spontaneous and almost like it's being performed on this sound chip. And to think that it couldn't be further from that.
Well, there's a level of almost like, I defy you to figure out how we made this, because it's like it's this immaculate machine, and there's so many moving parts and everything, and it's unlike any other kind of music. It's such a distinct style. It's
right.
Yeah, that's crazy to think about. I never in a million years could have imagined that was your process, that you were doing math and figuring out numbers like that for pitches. That's even more difficult than other experiences I've heard from composers programming.
But the thing is, you can look at it that way and you can think, oh, that's because, but the thing is, it's a bit like, if you think in dollars, then if you go to a different country, you convert that in your head back to dollars because dollars,
right.
But it's kind of, for us,
that's true.
We got into the habit of, we knew the numbers, and to convert that back into keys and notes would have been just as difficult.
Just another system.
It's just a different system, and but it was,
that's really interesting.
But it was kind of a liberating system because it was purely chromatic. Then you didn't think at all in terms of where you were, in terms of where's your bass note and where's your root key and things like that. It was just literally off at a tangent wherever it was chromatically going. So
nice to give a little bit more freedom, so you're not always going to be diatonic too. I imagine that helped with some of your modulations and your sense of freedom there tonally.
I think it probably did, I think it probably changed the way we wrote just because of that, just purely for technical reasons,
Well, I'm really fascinated. It seemed to be, for us, looking through your career, in the mid-'90s, it seemed like you had your fair share, or maybe unfair share, of games that you worked on that got canceled. Particularly, we think about things such as Time Tracks, which we have heard before that soundtrack is available online, but other things like Firearm and Moto X, it seemed like in the series of a couple years you had some games that got canceled. Do you recall your time working on those games and what the experience was like writing the music, and maybe what it felt like to have those games canceled?
In the case, the games that I can remember being canceled were all Malibu, which was
right
after we left Suffolk Creations. I remember I was more gutted about Time Tracks being cancelled than anything, because I did put quite a lot of effort into that one.
By the way, amazing work on that.
Well, the thing is, that was really the last 8-bit stuff I did, ever. I can't think. Yeah, it was the last 8-bit. It was the last stuff that I did with a music driver,
right.
And I really enjoyed it. And I remember thinking it was annoying because we at Suffolk Creations, they didn't develop any Sega games at all, so it was kind of a novel thing to do. And I really enjoyed it. And I remember thinking, oh, I wish I'd been doing this, more of this sort of thing. And now it's finishing, and that's the end of it, and I've kind of missed that.
Well, I mean, Tim Follin on the FM Synth Mega Drive is just a match made in heaven.
It didn't happen, unfortunately. Well, it happened briefly, yeah. Yeah.
Well, this is a great thing about having this stuff available now, is people are enjoying this music all around the world now, even if the game was never released.
Yeah.
And so because video game music is becoming more, eventually going from a niche thing to almost a quasi-mainstream thing now, and there's so many people around the world enjoying this music, it's really great that work wasn't lost forever.
I know, it was, I remember Time Tracks in the would have been late 90s or something like that. I remember thinking, having not heard it since I'd composed it, I remember looking for it somewhere and thinking, what did I genuinely wanted to know what I'd done because I didn't remember it at all. And it didn't exist. I remember Richard Jakes, actually, I did when I was doing Ecco the Dolphin with Sega at the time. I met Richard Jakes, and Richard Jakes managed to he said he knew someone who had some recordings of it, and he's got hold of some recordings. Oh. But it was kind of it wasn't really a thing then, it was kind of, no one knew about it at all. It was just happened to be someone had some old recordings.
Well, at some point in the early 2000s, someone got their hands on the ROM, and so it's available now. The actual files are people are enjoying it all over the place. So that's wonderful.
It is amazing.
You spoke a little bit about Ecco the Dolphin. I'm really curious about that point in your career. It seemed like it could have been a turning point for you. Obviously, a new system, an exciting system at the time.
Yeah.
It really that score of Ecco the Dolphin, Defender of the Future, is so relaxing and atmospheric, but just very different from anything else you had scored. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with that game?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of it came out of the blue. Dave Nolte, who was the producer on that, knew me, as all the jobs I got towards the end. It was just producers that knew me from the 8-bit days, got in touch with me and said, would you like to do this thing? And at the time I was really, I didn't know what to do. I'd more or less given up on doing music, I was trying out other things. And he, I saw the game, he sort of said, obviously it was quite an iconic original score on the Sega, the Genesis, wasn't it?
Right.
He told me about that, and I kind of listened to that and thought, well, I don't know how to compete with this really, because this is sort of, I'll have to just do something myself here. And at the time I was kind of listening to more John Adams, minimalist composer, that kind of thing. I'd kind of, it was just something I was into at the time, and I remember thinking, well, I could probably do something completely different now and do this sort of very minimalist score thing, and just basically just glorified atmospherics, sort of sound effects and things. Do a bit of singing, a bit of choral kind of stuff on it.
Well, it's funny, how common is that now? That's what almost everyone is doing now in film and in video games.
Yeah, it's strange. I always seem to miss these things. They seem to happen just at the wrong time. It seem to be either too early or too late on it. But it was interesting to do. It took me a long time to do it though, and I think in hindsight it was probably because I really just felt that, I did some early pieces and I was quite happy with some of the early pieces, but then of course, by that time it was getting to the point where you had to just write lots and lots and lots of music, and I started to realise that I just can't do that. I can churn stuff out. I can write short, fast pieces, and I can write quite a few of them, but just the amount of music that modern games, well, at that point anyway, that games were requiring, I just thought I can't really just churn out that amount of volume of music,
Right.
So I really struggled to just come up with enough music on that, really.
Well, I think it's so crazy to think that for all three of the Follin brothers, that your time in the video game industry was in some ways just like another job in the course of you finding your ultimate career path.
Yeah.
And perhaps maybe, the three of you think of it that way, way.
No.
But for so many people around the world, your music really stands the test of time, and it's so vital and still talked about to this day. It's inspiring composers and fans of video game music, and it's become something really of legend. I imagine that, not only did that never cross your mind all those years ago, but now, hopefully maybe you've had a little bit of exposure to some of the love just from people around the world. How does that feel, all these years later?
It's kind of bizarre, because it's kind of, like you say, it was kind of me more than Jeff. I think Jeff was very much it was very much a job that he was doing, and he moved on. As soon as that finished, he just moved on and did something else, he went into teaching, actually. But I was, I did enjoy doing it, and I remember putting a lot into it, but I didn't really think that anyone else would appreciate it. I didn't really think that was... I was just doing a job in the respect of I was providing a service, I was providing some music for these games that needed music, and sound. That fact also that, none of the people I worked with particularly, even though they were I remember them talking about the music and saying, oh yeah, I like that piece, or I like, whatever. Certainly early on, it was it wasn't really a thing. I don't know, it wasn't really something that people would really sort of say, this is a really important part of what you're doing, what I mean? It was tacked on afterwards, really, the music, it wasn't really a major part of it.
Right.
And also, I didn't have, at that time, because game music wasn't a thing, it certainly wasn't in the mainstream, nobody outside, a very small handful of people even got what it was, they didn't even most people wouldn't even identify it as music, they'd identify it as to them it might as well have been, I don't know, something coming out of a watch or something. Something that might as well have just been a glorified alarm or something, it didn't really they didn't even see it as music. And so so from point of view of composing it, even though obviously I was into it, it was very much in my own head, and I didn't really expect anybody else to really appreciate it, because I was just making stuff that I enjoyed listening to, and I enjoyed making those sounds, and experimenting with different things. But that's it's strange to think now that it has taken this long, hasn't it? But it's like you say, it's becoming more of a thing now, and it's I find it really strange, to be honest.
Well, it's so interesting because, so much video game music from that era, we really feel like we want to advocate for it and a lot of the rich musical qualities that it shares. But I do feel that there's this special thing about your music that it doesn't need that sort of lip service. Like, I think it transcends the platform and transcends the technology. I mean, some of the music, I remember the first time, I can't remember, but that track in Silver Surfer that goes like... I've never heard anything like that in video games. It's so confident. It's it's just messing with your expectations in such a way, and I don't know, it doesn't even sound like synths, and it's so advanced sounding. There's just nothing else like that. It's interesting to hear you talk about, video game music being viewed as like a glorified alarm clock, because I totally think a lot of people would have that opinion about it, but I really can't imagine those same people listening to your music and being dismissive in the same way, because it's in a league of its own, I think.
Oh, that's nice of you to say. I mean, obviously, it's that kind of stuff was, I mean, you said, it's confident, but it was it was certainly a very blind confidence. It wasn't certainly an arrogant thing. I wasn't sort of doing this stuff thinking, everyone will get my music. It was exactly the opposite. I really thought I might as well just do whatever I want to do here, because no one's going to get it anyway. It doesn't really matter.
That's amazing. Yeah, listening to that music, if if nobody knew, they would assume it comes from this wizard who, it's just the level of confidence that you hear in the finished product is just off the charts.
Right. Well, and rhythmically too, there's so much stuff that I imagine was really difficult to implement. I mean, so many like cool mixed meter things, and I mean, not to go back to that Plock example, but there's this guitar solo in it that's just the most nasty thing in the world.
Yeah, definitely a lot of cool like 7/8 sections in that.
Yeah, I remember doing that. That was a bit of a Queen inspiration, that one, I think. There's a bit of Brian May in that. I mean, you're saying it's kind of, a bit wild sort of thing. I mean, it obviously is quite wild, a lot of it, but it just comes from that. Really, it really was, to me, it wasn't, I didn't think I'm going to impress people with this, because if I'd thought at any point I'll make something that will impress people, I would have just gone off on a completely different tangent. I certainly wouldn't have been incorporating 70s references and things like that. Right. I mean, that same Plock tune, is that one or the Beach? I can't remember. It was basically Stevie Wonder, some of that. There were things in there that I'd put in there for my own amusement, essentially. And I didn't think anyone would really get it. So it's quite a shock, really, to find out that people.
Well, yeah, it's just so funny because a lot of especially younger players that were experiencing that at the time, they probably never heard Queen. They probably never heard these original inspirations, and so they're just listening to this music on its own and just appreciating it as that. And so it's very fascinating. I find your career arc very fascinating. And for you, it seems like you always come back to the world of media, to the world of entertainment, and you wear so many different hats and seem to really embrace all of them. So in your ideal future, would you continue to keep working in many different facets of media, or is there one in particular that you are the most passionate about?
No, I think you've said it there. I think I don't know really. I seem to be drawn to creating things, like making worlds or whatever it is. To me, it's always been about atmosphere, to be honest. It's that was listening. My first experience of listening to music was, to me, it was a definite, an atmosphere. A piece of music would have a definite physical place. It was almost kind of like I was listening to another dimension. I mean, so to me, it was kind of like, this is a place that exists. Certainly listening to like Yes, I remember getting into that and thinking, this is like, I want to go and visit this place. This is a real. So it was very tangible, that atmosphere, to me. And all the things that I've ever done have been kind of just trying to create those atmospheres, really, from in different ways, and that's, when I say atmosphere, kind of just, that could be just a general feel of something, certainly that's what it was with a lot of the 8-bit music, but then again, sometimes it's like the most recent media things I've been doing, this game and stuff, it just comes from an idea of having a feeling for a particular thing or atmosphere and trying to create it, and that's true across media. It doesn't really matter whether it's music or anything else. It's just a sort of a kind of nervous tick I have, I think. It just makes me want to do things, create things.
Well, that's so wonderful. Do you want to talk a little bit about your most recent foray back into games with the game Contradiction, that you were, seems like, heavily involved in the many different aspects of this game?
Well, it was kind of my idea. It didn't really exist as I think. It started out as an audio adventure game that was something that Jeff and I came up with in the 90s. It was quite a long time ago, and we kind of never did anything with it. We kind of had this idea of developing it at the time. The technology really didn't exist then to do it, and so we kind of shelved it. And then when I remember seeing the iPad and thinking, that's kind of, you could do that game, that video game.
Sure.
So that's where that came from. Basically, what I did was I kind of thought, I'll make a demo of this and see if it works. So I wrote what turned out to be quite a long demo, scripted it or structured it, sort of thing, which took me probably 6 months to do, just in my spare time.
Wow.
And ended up with a kind of a script that I could turn into something. And then I contacted an actor friend that I had, I knew, and said, "Would you like to just do a little? Would you like to be involved in this, basically?" And he came along and did a little teaser video for me, and then he helped get the cast together because he knew lots of different actors, and he kind of said, "Well, why don't you do it? Let's do it next week, sort of thing. Let's get everyone together and just push it." And then once it was shot, obviously I had to put it together. So it's kind of took me probably a year to put it together after we'd shot it, to be honest. But I still thought of it as a demo, right until it being published. I still do, to be honest, because it's full of holes and full of plot gaps and things, because, it wasn't really intended to be a completed game. But in the end, we had there was enough there to publish it, and it kind of it seems to have done pretty well, actually, which is a complete shock, because it was, as I say, I didn't expect anyone to even notice it existed, but it seems to have got a bit of attention on Giant Bomb, I think, and that kind of thing. So.
Well, it's definitely exciting for Tim Follin fans to hear that, he's coming back to the industry in some way, shape, or form. Is that something that you could see yourself going back to in the future, like making more games or composing more music, or what do you think?
Well, I've got another game in the pipeline right now that is, hopefully, I don't know what people are going to think of this game. It's crazy. It's another FMV-based type of game, because I kind of went into... the career I sort of jumped to after music was TV advertising and filmmaking. So,
right.
So I had these aspirations to make short films and things, and I did a few of those, and won a competition in Manchester, short film competition. And
Great.
From that, I got offered a job. I got this advertising company in Manchester gave me a job. And so I started doing that, and have been doing that for the last decade, to be honest, since that happened. But just in the last 3-4 years, I've been sort of, since Contradiction came about, I'm starting to branch off into doing that again now. So I'm definitely sort of seem to be heading towards the games thing again at the moment. So I don't know.
That's great.
I have a very candid question, and I really hope this won't be insulting to you, but how much money would it take to get you to create an entire new album of 8-bit chiptunes?
We're talking Prog here, Tim. We're talking Prog music.
Because we could raise it, we could mobilize the VGM fans out there, and we could make this thing happen.
We could fund it in a day.
The thing is, I would do it regardless anyway. To be honest, if I've got, more recently, see my 2 kids now are kind of getting into this.
Really?
Yeah, because they're my youngest is 11 actually now, and he's they're kind of both serious gamers, more so than I was at that age actually. And then again, the gaming scene didn't really exist when I was that age, but it's they're probably into it and into music as well. And I don't know. I'm just wondering whether that's going to be my avenue back into it when my youngest starts composing himself. And
oh my
so
gosh,
we'll see how it goes. We might end up with a sort of collaboration album or something.
Oh my god, a whole nother generation of
incredible.
Follins. This is insane.
Oh, this is so exciting.
Also,
we'll make it happen.
Well, the thing is,
Tim fans,
in a way, it's kind of, I do miss it, and I haven't done it for a long time, and I went through a long spell of thinking this is kind of something that was in the past. I don't really want to go over this again. But it's kind of one of those things. I think at the end of the day, I don't do anything if I don't think people are going to enjoy it. I'm genuinely motivated by the idea of making something that people can enjoy, and get into. So I think that's just, money doesn't really matter. I'm not really sort of motivated, even though I don't have any. I'm not motivated by it particularly. And so, much to my wife's constant irritation, but I'd like to look. It's just difficult to. I would have to look at these music drivers now and see whether I could get my head around them. To be honest, because
well, we'll just have to keep bombarding you. We'll just forward you every email we get asking for this until you finally agree to do it. And when I think about it, I feel like no matter what the kind of the endeavor is, I feel like you've just proven yourself that you can do so many different things. Even if I think of something like your score to Starsky and Hutch, which is one of the last things you did as a video game composer. Who would have thought that would have been something you were capable of doing, this like really authentic 70s throwback funk stuff? So I just feel like at this point you've just proven yourself, and if that project that we're talking about ever would have happened, I think it would be a smashing success.
Well, I'll you know what, I'll try and wrap this game up, and maybe that's what I'll do next. I don't know.
You heard it here first, folks.
Yeah. I'll try.
Wow. Well, Tim, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. This has been, we mean
Such
it from
a
the bottom
delight.
of our hearts, an absolute treat.
Oh, no problem.
And the last thing that we ever expected, I think both of us were like, oh, we could never get, Tim Follin to do an interview. It's like speaking with a legend. And so it's just really been so insane for us.
And more than anything, I feel like today was a public service to all those thousands of Fallen heads out there all around the world. So to all the fans out there, you're welcome.
Thanks again, Tim.